I'm Meg Bolger from Facilitator Cards, and I have been a professional facilitator for more than a decade now. I know I don't look it, but I have been. And in that decade, I have realized a few different things about facilitation and about how incredibly key facilitation is to participation is to facilitation. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be talking about how do we unlock the magic of participation? How do we empower people's voices when they're in the room with us? How do we help them? How do we help them be involved in the sessions that we're creating in their own education, in their own, in their own work, and that's what we're going to be focusing on today. We're going to start by giving you just a little bit of context of why participation, and then we're going to jump right into the details. So I want to talk really briefly about teaching versus facilitating versus lecturing. So this is a little graphic we've got here that can help us have this conversation. So up at the top, let's see if I can get the pointing right. Yes, no. Man, it's not going to happen. Top graphic is a visual of lecturing, right? So we've got this one-way communication, expert at the front of the room, talking to participants or to learners, no information necessarily flowing back from them. So that's lecturing. Teaching, we've got this two-way communication. We've got an educator speaking to learners, and there's also information coming back, right? We've got this piece of assessment, or we've got feedback like, oh, I don't understand that, or yes, I do, let's move on. And then we've got facilitating. Facilitating is down here at the bottom. I can point to that. And that is this multi-directional piece of like communication and information going between participants, going from the educator to the learners and back. And it is far more information coming from the group than just from the educator. And the key difference that there are two key differences that I want to point out between teaching, facilitating, and lecturing that might not be obvious other than this idea of like who's speaking more, that sort of thing. And those two things are how much agency do the students, the participants in the session have over that experience? How much do they shape it? How much do they change it? And how much participation is required for them, from them, right? So lecturing down here in the red is they don't need to participate. They can actually be asleep and they could still be being lectured at. And but they also get no control over the information that's being shared, right? Teaching, there's a little bit more. They need to participate. You need that feedback, that insight. Is this working? Is this not? You need them to like follow along. But they also therefore get more control, more agency over the information that they are experiencing and what the session looks like. And lastly, in facilitation, they have a ton of control, a ton of agency over the information that's being shared. But we also need them to participate. We need a lot of active participation for them to be able to get that level of control. So that's one of the reasons that for the last 10 years, I have been so interested and fascinated with participation. So what we're going to talk about today are three things that you can do to increase the likelihood that your students, your participants in your session or classroom are going to participate. And we're going to start with a really simple example, which is just the idea of like asking the question. Let's say you assigned a reading, whether that was pre-reading for the session you're leading or for the class you're leading, and you want to have a discussion about that reading. And you get up in the front of the room, look at your students, and you say, okay, what stood out to you from the reading? And you get nothing back, right? No responses, no people making moves to answer and help you out, or to help each other out. And you just go, oh, this is so annoying. And that moment has happened to so many of us. And what happens in that moment when we don't get the participation we need is that we often then have to kind of move up the levels of, we have to go from facilitating, which is what we were trying to do, trying to get them to learn from each other, and we now have to teach, or we now have to lecture. And if we don't get that participation, then we can't do that really participatory, involved, kind of like student-centric or participant-centric session. So that can be really disheartening. So let's talk talk about what are the different things that we could do, what are the different levers we could pull in order to change the outcome of asking that question into the group and getting nothing back. So, lever number one that we are going to pull is we are going to change up the group size. So imagine that instead of asking your students, okay, what stood out to you from the reading, and asking that to all of the folks in the room, instead you start out by just asking them as individuals to reply. So this little circle is just going to indicate just one person. So if we wanted to do this as an individual activity, the way I would do that is I would say, okay, everybody pull out a piece of paper, and I want you to write down one thing that stood out to you from the reading. So just doing a quick, I call this a minute paper. So if you're going to do a quick minute paper, and this is a facilitator card that is in our deck of different tools and processes that you can use to facilitate groups. So a minute paper is just asking people to, instead of responding out loud, take out a piece of paper and write down their response, right? Do this as an individual first. So that would be the smallest group size and a way to do that same question in a new way. Let's say we want to make that a little bit bigger. We want 2 people to interact. We want people to work in pairs. We could do a pair and share. This is another facilitator card that I love. Let's see if I pulled it out. Yup. So pair and share is just this idea of putting people into groups and having them pair up and share their responses. I actually really like doing a minute paper into a pair and share. So what that would look like is I would get up and say, okay, so I want you to take out a piece of paper, and in 1 minute, I want you to write down one thing that stood out to you from the reading, or 2 things that stood out to you from the reading. Then I would do a turn to the person next to you and tell them what stood out to you. One thing that's really interesting about group size is that when people will totally abandon, not respond to the large group, they rarely will do that in pairs because they would be just abandoning one other person. And they're also only being asked to share with one other person, right? Which is a much lower risk environment. People don't want to look stupid in front of other people or say something that other people are just like, what are you talking about? So the more people we ask them to talk in front of, the higher risk that interaction is. So when you ask them to think for just themselves, as you do when you're asking them to work in individuals, that's a low risk type of interaction, or a lower risk. And then pairs, slightly higher than individual, but still much, much lower than a large group, right? And then maybe we want to turn it into, okay, let's have you work in a small group. And again, you could layer this where you could say, we're going to do minute papers, then we're going to go pair and share, then we're going to go small group. Or you could start in the small group and say, I want your small group to come up with 5 things that stood out to you. Right? So maybe that's the thing that you ask. That's the question that you ask the small groups. And what's interesting about small groups is that when people are in small groups, and then you come back to the large group and you can ask that same thing, what stood out to you from the reading? People can now share, and they can say, in my small group we talked about, and they're no longer having to speak for themselves. They just have to speak for the collective, and that lowers that risk of sharing again. It makes it a little bit safer because you're not just saying your opinions, you're now saying your small group's opinions. And that just puts a little bit of distance between you and the things that you're saying. So going back to that first exercise, or that first scenario, what stood out to you from the reading? Instead of asking it into the large group first, what I would suggest trying is try doing it in an individual way, try doing it in pairs, or try doing it in a small group and see if you get more participation from that. And again, what's cool is you can even go up You can go up and say, okay, we're going to start as individuals, then we're going to go small group, then large group. Or we're going to start as pairs and then go small group and then large group. Or we're just going to start as individuals and then go large group, right? You can move through the group sizes. I think often starting as small as possible or as small as you want to try and then working larger. So that is the first thing that we wanted to talk about. Wanted to talk about that lever and that ability to change group size. Okay, so that's a really key thing that we can do to increase participation. We can lower the risk of participating by lowering that group size, and we can kind of like scale up that group size in order to get participation where we know people have already thought about the question that we're asking. I rarely start by asking in the large group. I often start small and go bigger. Okay, so that's group size. Lever number 1 that we can pull and that we can change as facilitators. Lever number 2 that we can change is we can change up props and materials. So what I mean by that is just, are you asking people to mostly say things out loud? Are you mostly relying on people saying things out loud, or as discussion being the only kind of way that you're asking for participation? I find that getting people to participate with by using kind of props and materials really changes up the possibilities and makes it more likely that people will participate, especially if we've been relying on a lot of discussion-based kind of answering. So to me, there are kind of like 3 or 4 main kind of like modalities that we can ask from our groups. So that is talking, writing, drawing, and then kind of like physical embodiment, right? And then we can think of that kind of like medium, like are they talking, are they drawing, are they writing, are they physically kind of embodying something? Or we can also think about what materials are necessary for them to do this activity, to answer this question. So is it paper and pen? Is it markers and flip charts? Is it something like Play-Doh or some sort of modeling thing, sticky notes, tape, like putting things up on the wall? Like, those are lots of different props that we can use to change those things up. So let's go back to that original question. What stood out to you from the reading? So if you wanted to do that same question, but have them write, we kind of gave that example already with minute papers, right? Just the idea of writing something down before you say it out loud will make participation go up. Because you can say, I see you writing. Like, I see you writing. I know you have thoughts. So why don't you tell me one thing you wrote down rather than one thing you're thinking, right? As soon as you can take it from that thinking into a physical place, that will change like the way you're able to invite participation. So we can do that same, what stood out to you from the reading, and just say, I want you to write it down, and then I want you to share out loud. Or we could say, okay, I want everybody to write this down on a sticky note, and we're going to put it up on the board, or we're going to write it down on our piece of paper. We're going to take a piece of tape and stick it to the wall. And rather than have people share out loud, I'm going to have everybody walk up to the wall, read other people's notes, and then we're going to have the discussion, right? One thing that allows is just this idea that people can participate, like kind of get their ideas out there without having to say them. And then what's cool is you can say, all right, so what you saw in the sticky notes, what's one thing that jumped out to you that wasn't yours? And all of a sudden people are giving voice to other people's ideas, right? So that idea of writing it down before, and then having people interact with the writing of somebody before we're going to that discussion, that can also increase participation. Writing is one really cool way. You can also do drawing. So you could say, I want you to draw 3 things that stood out to you from the reading last night. And you could clarify, you don't need to be an artist. You could totally stick figure this, but I just want you to like doodle them. You could even make it so that people kind of have to do something kind of weird or challenging, like a single line drawing where they can't live their pen from the paper. Like something like that can also make it just a little more interesting to respond. Another way that you can do it, which is to kind of use paper in this like novel way, is let's say you want to get a bunch of responses to that same prompt, but you don't want students to have to say them out loud. Have them write it down on a piece of paper, crumple up that piece of paper into what I call a snowball, and have them throw it at the board, right? And then you can pick up a snowball, open it up, read out the thing, and then have a discussion from that. So just this idea of getting people to externalize their thoughts in a way that isn't in out loud will lower the barrier for participation for a lot of people, while like making it possible for them to interact in new and interesting ways with that same question. All right, so last thing we're going to talk about is, we've talked about props and materials, we've talked about group size, and the last thing, which I think you can layer on top of all of the both of those things, is this idea of novelty. So oftentimes we ask people questions that they are expecting or that they're kind of tired of answering, and just changing how we frame the conversation can completely change the amount of participation that we're going to get. So rather than saying, what was the most interesting thing that stood out to you from the reading last night? What about doing a little bit of opposite thinking? So opposite thinking would say, what were the 3 most boring parts of the reading last night? Or what were the things that you think were just totally forgettable let's make as long a list of those things, right? So just asking it in an interesting way of like, what didn't stand out to you from the reading? What felt mundane or boring or forgettable? Like, that's just a different type of question. Instead of asking like, what makes a great leader? Ask, what makes a terrible leader? If you wanted to be a terrible leader, how would you do that, right? That idea of mixing up the structure you're asking that question totally changes how much energy there is to answer it. Another way you can do that is if you're, running a brainstorm, like, what are all the books we want to read this year? Instead of just saying, what are all the books we want to read this year? You could say, what are 100 books we could read? Not that you want to. They could be bad. They could be like they could just be like kids' books, like Bernstein Bears, or they could be, like War and Peace, and it would just be way too long. Like, I want us to list 100 books. Then we're going to whittle the list down to like the 10 books we might want to read, right? But rather than start with just the 10 books we want to read, actually start with what are 100 books and then go bring the list down from there. That type of brainstorming, that type of changing up the way that you're asking the question can really change how people are interacting or like feel drawn to actually answering the question. So that idea of novelty, that idea of adding a bit of novelty, of adding a new way of asking the same question can really change and I think like encourage participation. So if you're like, well, but how do I get ideas for novelty? Like, how do I get ways to ask questions that I maybe haven't thought of before? So one of those ways is to think about structure, is to think about those 2 elements of group size and props. And another is to just look for other people who have already answered this question, other resources and tools. And I'll just show you that to wrap us up here. I'll show you one of those places, which are these facilitator cards that I've mentioned a couple of times. So we'll leave information about where you can find facilitator cards. If you want to buy yourself a deck, you can totally do that, and we will leave information below. Having them on hand is really great. You can also make your own in terms of just writing these ideas down on index cards. So we mentioned this idea of minute papers. Just write yourself a little index card to remind yourself, oh yeah, I can pull out this idea of doing a minute paper at any time. Having them on index cards rather than like lost in notes can be really helpful for using it. So if you want more of these ideas like minute papers, pair share, 100 ideas that we've talked about today, then we'll also leave information that you can find to go to this website. So the website is facilitator.cards, right? And facilitator.cards, if you come up here to the menu and go to the cards, you can actually look at all 60 cards in the deck. So like 100 ideas is right here. And if you click on the card, you can read it. We've got a virtual facilitation guide. And if there is a video about it, which I think we've done for analogizing, well, maybe not. Let's see if we can find one with a video. Let's find minute papers here. Okay, and if we've got this video, you'll see my over-exuberant face right here. We'll actually tell you a little bit more about how to facilitate that particular process. So facilitator cards are going to be a really cool way to actually get to know, like, what are some novel ways to ask familiar questions or some new ideas for structures for facilitation. So that's going to do it for our little mini lecture here on unlocking the magic of participation. To me, facilitation is all about making things easy. Facilitation literally means to make easy. And the idea of facilitating in a way to make participation as easy as possible, that's our goal. And that's the thing that I hope that you can unlock a little bit more of with this idea of group size and novelty and materials. That changing those things up can take a simple question where you're not getting any participation and turn it into a really fruitful, exciting, energizing conversation just by adjusting a few little things. So, wishing you the best of luck. If you need any additional support, please look for more information below about all of the information that we've shared so far. And until next time, everyone, happy facilitating.